much. Yeah, I'm Radko. I'm the founder and CEO of Bitbond. Bitbond is a global marketplace for small business loans. And since day one, when we launched the company in 2013, we've been using cryptocurrencies for payment processing in order to be able to achieve a global reach with our service. And as part of that, we've been very early on by using blockchain technologies and by being very familiar with the space in general. And so obviously since the last couple of years, the technology has evolved further. There are many new applications that are being run on top of these technologies. And today I want to talk about the Dapps and their impact on marketplaces. Dapps stands for Decentralized Applications. Throughout the talk, I will elaborate a little bit more what these actually are, and then look at some use cases and how Dapps can impact marketplace businesses in general. And so the first part of the presentation is really an introduction into blockchain technologies and specifically Dapps. Not everybody may be familiar with these, and so I just want to give a quick run through of what these actually are. So first of all, when we look at where blockchain is coming from, blockchain is a technology that was an invention when someone wanted to create digital cash, which did not exist until just a couple of years ago due to the fact that digital assets are inflationary. When you have an image file, a text file, it can be copied infinitely, and therefore if you wanted to use it as a unit of account, as a currency, it does not really serve that well because you can copy it so many times and it's losing its value. However, then the inventor of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, came up with the concept of the blockchain, which effectively solves this double spending problem, this inflationary problem we have with digital assets. And he solved it through creating a public distributed ledger where every transaction is publicly visible and can be traced down in this ledger. And therefore, if someone were to spend a currency unit that they already spent in the past, they couldn't spend it a second time. And therefore, there's a uniqueness now in digital assets through this, as it's also called, distributed ledger technology. At the core, a blockchain is nothing else but a database which is storing all the transactions and which keeps track of timestamps and transaction amounts. So at the core, it's very simple with the tweak that it's a distributed database which cannot be controlled by one single centralized party, but which is distributed across ideally many thousands of copies that need to be in sync. On this screenshot, we see a symbolized distribution of the nodes in the Bitcoin network. A node is typically a server that stores a full copy of the blockchain, which means that there's a full transaction history stored. And if I wanted to change the history, if I wanted to create money units that I don't have, I would need to update all the copies of the blockchain. In the case of Bitcoin, it's over 10,000. In the case of Ethereum, also one of the most popular cryptocurrency / distributed ledger technologies, there's also over 10,000 nodes. And while it is technically possible, the cost that would be attached to such an attack, if I wanted to fraudulently change the history, is prohibitively high. So these technologies are also called this distributed ledger, and the distributed ledger is simply the record of transactions. However, there needs to be an incentive in order to actually provide this infrastructure and to run these blockchains. And in order that there is an incentive, each blockchain typically, at least in the case of public blockchains, has a native currency, a coin, which rewards those people who make sure that the transaction history is correct and who add new transactions to the ledger. Because if everybody could write to this database, then everybody, of course, could also create new currency units that they actually don't have. So there needs to be a mechanism, it's called the technical term is a consensus mechanism, how new transactions get entered into the ledger. And those people who keep track of that have a financial incentive to do that. In the case of Bitcoin, it's the native currency Bitcoin, so there's a match in the name. In the case of Ethereum, for example, the native currency is called Ether. In the case of Stellar, the native currency is called Stellar Lumens. And so these currencies provide incentive to keep the network up and running. Since Bitcoin was released in early 2009, of course there was a lot of evolution happening. Bitcoin was really just created as digital cash, and the functionalities that Bitcoin has additionally to that cash functionality are fairly limited, and they are limited by purpose, because Bitcoin was just created for digital cash and not to be more. Ethereum, however, has been created to be much more than just a digital currency. Ethereum's idea and the idea of Vitalik Buterin, the creator and inventor of Ethereum, was to create a decentralized computer, which can do much, much more than just digital cash payments. And then, as an evolution of that, there were many other blockchains developed after Ethereum, or some of them even in parallel with Ethereum, and many of those are actually use case specific. We won't have enough time to dive into all of these, but what's important here is that there are many different technologies, and most of those serve different purposes. So it's just like when you want to buy a car, when you want to drive fast, you buy a sports car. When you have a family, you may want to buy a van. So it's very use case specific, which is the best blockchain to use. Now let's dive more into these additional functionalities on top of the payment functionality. So when you do payments with Bitcoin or with Ether, then you have regular tokens. I send 1 Bitcoin, someone can pass it on, and that's it. However, these transactions can also store metadata on a technical level. And this is where the exciting part begins, because I could use a blockchain as a messaging service where I could just type a hello world message, or I could even put in a contract that now has a timestamp and is now forever recorded in the blockchain. So I could store static information. Additionally to that, I could use this functionality to make a tiny amount of Bitcoin or a tiny amount of Ether represent a different asset. So I would not be interested in the monetary value of the transaction itself, but I'm attaching other assets to that. And therefore also we have this colored coins concept, because you could even think of it, you take a physical coin and you write on that physical coin, it may be a €1 coin, you write on it, this coin actually represents my house. And whoever owns this €1 coin that has written on it that this coin represents the house is actually also the owner of the house and not just the owner of the token. And in that case, the euro coin just becomes a token which represents another asset. And this is a use case that's extremely popular on top of blockchains. And then the third part is that this metadata cannot just store static information, but it could even, and it can even, execute code. So like an if-then statement. So if a certain state of the world exists, then do something, pay out something to someone, or change the status of another program. And the last part that I just spoke about, where you can execute code on the blockchain, is also called smart contracts. Smart contracts are simply pieces of code that are stored in the blockchain, and as we have seen on a screenshot that these nodes are distributed over multiple thousands of computers, then all of these computers in parallel are executing these pieces of codes, the software, and that makes them immutable. So just like a Bitcoin or an Ethereum transaction is immutable, and once I have made the payment, it cannot be reversed unless my counterparty willingly sends me back my money. Also, the software that is running on top of blockchains is immutable. No third party who hasn't access to the private keys that are signing the execution of the software can alter it. At the same time, it's running at relatively low cost. And there's one side note that's important. You can only really do it for quantifiable circumstances. So on the blockchain, you could not make a judgment whether this is really a white share or a gray share, right? You need to be able to express circumstances in numbers. as I mentioned, so these pieces of code are also called smart contracts. However, the term smart contracts can be slightly misleading because a contract in our kind of everyday world implies that there are multiple parties that agree on something. However, each smart contract consists of smart contract code, which is simply a piece of software code. And this is also what we call a decentral application. So software that is running on a blockchain is called a decentral application. It doesn't require it, however, to have multiple parties being part of that. If we have multiple parties, then we speak of a smart legal contract, and that's actually what we would normally conventionally understand under the term contract. That's where multiple parties agree on something. And of course, you can run such a smart contract, but not every smart contract necessarily is a smart legal contract. Some of them are simply a decentralized application that are running on a blockchain. You could, for example, run a very simple script that tells the computer count from 1 to 1 million, where each step, each count represents 1 second. So it would take 1 million seconds until this computer has counted until 1 million. There's no other party involved. This is simply a script running, but you could execute that on a blockchain and it would be a decentral application, a Dapp. Now let's take one slightly more exciting example. So let's assume someone wants to bet on where the temperature tomorrow at 1 p.m. in Berlin is going to be in Celsius. Will it be more than 20 degrees Celsius or will it be below that? Now, if everybody in this room participated in this bet, everybody could take a piece of paper, write down what they think where the temperature will be tomorrow at 1 p.m. We could put all those papers into one box. Tomorrow we meet again, put out those papers and see who is closest to the real temperature. And then everybody put also some money into the box, €1 per person or whatever we agreed on. And we could run that bet in such a way. We could also run the bet as a decentralized application where everybody enters into this program what they think what the temperature will be, and they also send the payment. And if this program, if this software was running on a blockchain, I would not need to trust the other parties to the bet. I would not need to trust you guys that tomorrow at 1 p.m. you will actually show up and you will actually bring the money that you wanted to bet. But the moment the bets are off, I know for sure that if I win, I will actually receive my payout. And I don't even need to know who you are, and I don't need to look into your financials. I don't need to think about whether I trust you guys or not. So we would run this as a decentral application, and everybody who participates would be certain and would know for a fact that this happens exactly the way we agreed it. Now, so far this was pretty theoretical. However, Dapps really do already exist, and the biggest thing that I want you to encourage to do is actually to check them out. You can participate in Dapps and you can use apps via a conventional browser like a Chrome browser, Firefox, whatever you are using. You just need to install a plugin. One of the most popular ones is MetaMask. So you would install MetaMask as a browser plugin. You would need to add, in the case of MetaMask, some Ether to it. So your MetaMask browser plugin also serves as a wallet, because in the dApps that you participate in, normally there will be some payments need to be done. So it doesn't have to be a huge amount. It could be the equivalent of 10, 20 euros. But you will need to have some balance in there in order to participate in most dApps that exist. And I would recommend you go to one site, for example, stateofdapps.com, where you can find a list. It's almost like a directory, and there are games, and there are many other categories, and to just check it out, because then it becomes way less theoretical than if you just hear me talking about it. One other thing that's pretty handy, which is relatively similar to the state of dApps, is the Dapp Radar, which is also like a directory of dApps, and it has really, really nice statistics which show you how many users each of these dApps has had. Of course, this is just a screenshot. The list is way longer than just these 5 dApps. But it gives you a very good indication of how popular these applications actually are. And you can even list them by blockchain. So I'm now talking most of the time about the Ethereum blockchain because so far it has proven to be the most popular one, the most popular platform to run dApps on top. But there are also dApps on EOS, which is another alternative blockchain. There are dApps on Tron. So on this directory, you could even look at which dApps exist on top of which blockchain. Now, one other important remark here, this is really early days. This is like 1980s email. If you look at the number of users, the top dApp, I created a screenshot just a couple of days ago. It had 926 users on that day. So this is tiny, tiny small. This is a niche market where just a couple of geeks who are really into this stuff are trying this and are working with this, right? This doesn't have huge scale where we would be talking about tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands or millions of users, right? This is a niche phenomenon as of today, which doesn't make it less important. I just want to put it into perspective that these things are far, far away from reaching a big scale. So now that I hope we have a bit of a common understanding of what dApps are and what we are talking about here, I want to dive into more marketplace-specific questions and use cases. So first of all, what's important to highlight is that dApps don't necessarily create new applications that we have not seen before. We're talking about payments, computing, storage. This is stuff that obviously already exists since multiple years. That's not the revolutionary part. The revolutionary part is that these applications now don't have a central operator. And this may have some implications that could be quite interesting. One of the implications is that they are unstoppable. To give one concrete example, probably most of the people in this room know what AWS, what Amazon Web Services is. Most startups run their infrastructure on AWS. Now, if AWS were to shut down, I know, relatively unlikely, but let's assume it happens, then everyone who's running their services, their apps on AWS would suddenly, out of the blue, need to have a new service provider. Or what could also happen is that AWS continues to exist just fine, however, they decide that they don't like you and they don't want you to have you on their platform. Then they could exclude certain individuals, certain organizations that they don't like, and now these guys would need to find a new service provider. dApps are censorship-free, so they're out there on public blockchains like Ethereum, and everybody can use them as long as you stick to the rules. Typically, these are tied to payments and certain program characteristics. But there is no selection based on random criteria, but everybody faces the same rules. So this is just a summary of what I just said. There's no third party that can deny access to these apps. And even if the team that created a dApp disappears, the dApp will still continue to exist, which is also quite interesting, right? So once you have a dApp that has proven that the code is correct and it's running the way it's supposed to, then even if the team disappears that created it, it will still continue to exist and work. Now, dApps are not necessarily more efficient than their conventional alternatives. In some cases, they may be less efficient. In some cases, they may be more efficient. So this is something that needs to be kind of decided on a case-by-case basis. However, what's sure is that they are immutable. What I just said, right? You cannot just make it disappear. And in the Western world, censorship might not be a big thing for us where we would think about this every day. But I, for example, I've been born in a socialist country. It was Czechoslovakia back then, what today is Slovakia. And censorship actually back then was a big thing. You could not just speak your mind. You could not just say whatever you wanted, right? So censorship freedom is underappreciated while actually everything is fine. But once you find yourself in a situation where censorship really hurts you, then you would start to really value it and really see what it can actually bring. So while not many people may appreciate this at first sight, I'm just saying it may be worth more than we may realize in the world where we live in today, fortunately. And yeah, as I said, sometimes there may be trade-offs, right? Some dApps are slower than their conventional alternatives. So just like with every tool that you use, with every software that you use, you need to be aware of whether the advantages that dApps bring are bigger than maybe the disadvantages that they have in terms of also UX, speed, costs, and all that stuff. So just like with any infrastructure decision, you just need to go through your criteria and then decide based on that whether this is the right platform for you or not. Now, so given all of these factors that I went through, who may be interested in running dApps? First of all, these may be people or organizations who don't have access to the conventional alternatives. When we go back to the AWS example, when you want to use AWS, I mean, it's more or less censorship-free. Probably AWS doesn't, care a great deal about who you are. However, they definitely care about whether you can pay them, right? They won't give you access to the infrastructure if you don't have a credit card or a bank account. Now, if you don't have that, then AWS certainly will not like you and will not let you use their services. If you have an alternative to that, which is a dApp, where you can pay with cryptocurrencies and you don't need a bank account or a credit card, then suddenly the decentral alternative to AWS may be extremely interesting to you, even if it may not have the same performance as AWS, but just the fact that you now have access to a cloud infrastructure may make it very interesting for you. And then also people who don't want to have their applications to be censored. One relatively big app that I'm actually going to show in a minute is a prediction marketplace, right? And sometimes people may want to ask for a prediction about facts that not everybody may like, that somebody is asking this question at all, right? And so in that case, it's also a huge advantage if this application is actually censorship-free. Now, here's an example to dive more now into these actual applications. On the left-hand side, there is a tech stack of a conventional web application. So, by the way, I'm not paid by AWS, but it's just one of the most popular cloud services, so that's why I'm bringing it up here. So you may use S3 as a file system, you may run a Postgres database, your computational engine may be EC2, you programmed everything in Ruby, you use PayPal to accept payments, and the marketplace that you run is eBay. I'm not sure whether this is the actual tech stack of eBay, but theoretically, you could run a service like eBay on top of this tech stack. Now, for each layer in this tech stack, you may find a decentral alternative. So Filecoin has been created to be a decentralized file system, and they're not the only ones, there are others as well. A database technology from BigChain is also a decentral alternative. Golem is a marketplace for computational power, which is a decentral application itself. So you can source CPU from this decentral marketplace without anybody having you to grant permission to get that CPU power from there. And all of these can run on top of Ethereum, which is then kind of the equivalent of AWS. So as I said at the beginning, Ethereum was built with the purpose to become a decentral computer. And that's exactly what it is. It may not be perfect. It's definitely got a lot of disadvantages compared to conventional systems today in terms of efficiency, but it's definitely on the way to becoming that. It's got its own programming language. Ethereum has its own currency, so you could use Ether, but you could also use another dApp for payments, which is Bitcoin, because that's what Bitcoin at the end of the day is. It's a decentralized application for payments. And your equivalent to eBay could be OpenBazaar, for example, which is a marketplace for goods, which runs on a decentralized platform. Of course, there's a team that's developing it, but everybody who participates in OpenBazaar runs an OpenBazaar node, and therefore, even if the team of OpenBazaar that developed it were to disappear, the nodes would still exist, and this marketplace would still be up and running. Here is another overview of a couple of dApps. Some of those we have seen on the previous slide, but some of them are also quite interesting here. For example, Steemit. Steemit is a social network which has its own Steemit currency, and if you want to post and if you want to read a post, then you pay with the native currency that is just existing for this specific marketplace. ETHLands, for example, is the equivalent to Upwork. ETHLands is a very simple job marketplace, which is a decentralized application itself. So if you, for example, offer services on Upwork, Upwork is not happy with the customer support that you provide and they exclude you from the marketplace, you may still go to ETHLands, which is censorship-free, and everybody is free to use it. Again, this comes with other challenges. I'm perfectly aware of that. I'm just saying there may be people, there may be organizations who appreciate the fact that these applications are censorship-free and no third party can refuse access to these. Here are a couple of more examples. This is the logo of Augur, the prediction marketplace that I mentioned. I think the others we went through. Numerize, also a very interesting one. It's effectively a decentralized hedge fund where people, mainly researchers, build opinions about market development, and there are people who demand these opinions and who make the investment decisions based on that, but they don't know each other, and it's also a decentralized application where everybody can participate. So very interesting concepts that are coming up here. And then additionally to that, where decentralized applications are marketplaces, there are marketplaces that make use of individual layers of decentralized applications. So Bitbond, that's the company that I started. Bitbond in itself is not a decentralized application. It's a relatively conventional centralized server with a conventional database where we bring together borrowers and investors. However, we use one layer. We use cryptocurrencies for payment processing because we wanted to create a global marketplace for SME loans, something that did not exist when we founded it. And one of the challenges that we ran into was how do we process payments from A to B across borders at low cost and faster than the conventional alternatives, which typically would be bank transfers. When we started out, we used Bitcoin because back then it was the only really viable cryptocurrency. In the meantime, we have shifted away from Bitcoin to Stellar, which is a blockchain which is highly optimized for payments. It's much more scalable than Bitcoin. It's simply a technological evolution compared to Bitcoin. And then it's got a couple of other features that make it technologically advanced compared to Bitcoin. And so while today we are still a conventional centralized application, we make use of a decentralized application because the conventional alternatives and the centralized alternatives that are out there are simply far, far away from being as efficient and from being as accessible as the one that we're using, in this case, Stellar. Expedia is doing something similar. They, among other conventional payment methods, they accept Bitcoin for hotel reservations. Now, for Expedia, this might not be a huge plus in their revenue. However, for some people, again, who don't have other means of shopping online and paying online, but whose only digital payment method is a cryptocurrency, they probably highly appreciate the fact that Expedia is accepting Bitcoin as a payment method. So again, we are in a scenario where it's not advantageous for everybody, but people who are excluded from conventional systems, they may highly appreciate the fact that there are censorship-free and permissionless systems that they can use. Another big topic, Kik, which is a messaging platform, which was looking for new ways to monetize their service and to create an incentive for their users to stay on their platform. Introduced a token called KIN, which now is becoming a payment method within the Kik app. So again, while Kik itself remains a centralized application, they make use of the fact that you can have colored coins which may represent different assets and different value, and they have created a token which now helps them to monetize their service better. So again, they are just using also one layer of the decentralized applications. I think we can skip this. We've been speaking about payments. One thing that I want to elaborate a little bit more on is tokens, because this is a very, very big sector in itself. Tokens allow you to access users and investors across the world with way less, let's say, friction than conventional systems. Probably everybody has heard the term initial coin offering. So these are, in most cases, actually equity fundraisers. However, much more accessible than, for example, IPOs, where you probably need to make hundreds and millions of revenue in order to be able to afford an IPO, in order to be able to afford the fees for investment banks and all the parties that are typically involved. And now, as a two-person startup, you can effectively access a global capital market. Again, also comes with new challenges that need to be solved. However, the fact that now everybody has access to a global capital market, in my perspective, is really, really exciting. And then, of course, you can have tokens that represent many other things. One example would be loyalty points, where, for example, when you collect miles and more miles, or air miles from other airlines and alliances, typically these are closed systems where when you want to get your money out of the system, there is no free market where you could sell your miles. You would typically need to book another flight with one of the airlines that are participating, or you would need to shop at their online shop. However, when the loyalty points are digital tokens that are based on a public permissionless blockchain, then there's a free market for these tokens and you can just sell them, and you're not in that closed system that this airline created. So there are a lot of applications that are on top of this, and this is probably one of the areas of decentralized applications that is most active in terms of users and in terms of organizations that are using these. And certainly more advanced than the dApps that I had shown on the dApp radar, where there are games and other applications. Which of course doesn't mean this is the only sector that will remain relevant, because the other sector with games and like eLands and these platforms, it's just very, very early days. And I suspect and I predict that there will be more decentralized applications that will also get to a similar scale like we have seen in the investment world. Good, I think we wrap it up here in order to also reserve some time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Radoslav, for your presentation. We now have a few minutes for a Q&A session, then we'll be off for a break and restart after that. So.
Hey, thank you very much. What would be the business models behind such distributed marketplaces? Because in the traditional world, you have somebody as an intermediary taking a commission or something. I'm just new to this. What are the business models behind the decentralized alternatives?
Yeah, very good question. So we've got an example here of a decentralized exchange. This is called EtherDelta, and there are some others like this. EtherDelta is a decentralized exchange for tokens that have been created on top of Ethereum, right? So only Ethereum-based tokens can be traded here. And this is a screenshot. You can access it. Again, you need this browser plugin. You need MetaMask in order to be able to trade here. But then the guys who set this up, just like in conventional exchange, are taking a cut out of those trades, right? So you pay them a commission for the fact that you're using that marketplace. However, the difference is that this is a permissionless marketplace. There's no real sign-up or login. Once you have this browser plugin, MetaMask, installed, you can use that marketplace. But the monetization model is very similar to other marketplaces as well. They just take a cut out of the transaction volume. And the same is true for other marketplaces that are dApps themselves. The programmers would typically design it in a way that they in some way take a cut out of the transaction. Because that's also the beauty about these. You have the payments already integrated, right? Because the payments are always done through tokens or through the native cryptocurrency on top of the blockchain that you're using, right? So EOS, Ethereum, whichever you have chosen. So the payments are running through the platform that you have created, and you're not even using a third-party payment processor, but it's already integrated in a protocol that you're using, and therefore it's relatively easy to take a cut of the transactions.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a question on sort of scalability of the audience. I think one of the challenges with dApps is that it does rely on, having access to cryptocurrency, right? So any marketplace that is here today in this conference, the overlap between their user bases and people who have cryptocurrencies is probably close to zero. And I think that's the challenge, right? How do you get from owning cash or having a bank account or having a credit card to, participating into the crypto ecosystem? So, and I guess until we solve that challenge, the crypto world will remain essentially a niche audience world. So how do you look at that? How do you solve for that?
So in general, I believe that the consumer audience for these types of applications will always be small, because most people have access to fairly decent, centralized, conventional alternatives. As a German citizen living in Berlin, you don't have much incentive using a decentralized marketplace like OpenBazaar instead of eBay or Amazon. It doesn't provide you any added value most of the time unless your bank shut down your bank account, right? But this will be just a small percentage of the population. And this is not just true for Germany, this is probably true for the majority of the Western world at least, right? So the number of consumers that will want to use these dApps will always be small in my perspective, and there won't even be the need for huge scale. Where I believe we will see much more scale than where we see today is in the B2B space, where these technologies are used as infrastructure technologies, where the consumer might not even notice it. So when you send a bank wire transfer from, I don't know where you live, let's assume you are from France, and you send a wire transfer from France to the US, from, I don't know, a Société Générale bank account to Bank of America bank account. Then today the banks will be using the SWIFT system in order to route that payment, which is one of the reasons why it's so small, so slow and so expensive. Now, if they were to replace that with Stellar, for example, or with Ripple, which is another alternative that's here to replace SWIFT, you won't know about that as a consumer, right? The only thing that you will notice is that, well, a couple of years ago, this payment used to take 5 days. Now it's settled within 10 seconds, and it used to cost maybe 4 or 3% of the transaction value, and now it's costing me 0.1 or 0.2% of the transaction value, right? But you won't really care about how that is being done. Just like consumers don't care how Amazon went from, I don't know, it took them 5 days to ship a book to now almost same-day delivery, right? We don't care about which technologies Amazon is using in order to make that happen, right? And so in the B2B space, in some cases where, again, there are difficulties to access certain applications, or where the conventional alternatives are less efficient than decentralized applications, there we will see a much bigger scale of usage, but as a consumer, you may not even perceive it, and you won't have to worry about how do I get cryptocurrency in order to use that service.
So just a quick question. Certainly the censorship-free makes sense, and it kind of leads to the next question of, is there any of these that are truly anonymous, or can we achieve true anonymity? Because my understanding is everything can eventually be traced back to a point, because there is a ledger, even if you went through Ether, Bitcoin, whatever, to whatever coin it is.
So, these technologies are called pseudonymous because if you put a 10 euro bill on the table and I send you the equivalent in Bitcoin from my phone to your phone, then it will be extremely hard for anybody to find out, who was actually involved in the transaction, who was the individual. Everybody can look up the transaction in the blockchain, but if someone were to find out, was it you and I, it would be nearly impossible. However, that would be a relatively small and an economically less relevant transaction, let's say. If we were to exchange the equivalent of $1 million, let's say, right? So you're not coming just with a 10 euro note, but you're coming with a suitcase full of notes, then this transaction is bigger. Now, when you were to receive the equivalent in Bitcoin, you will probably want to do something with that. In most cases, you will not just store those BTC and just let it sit there for a couple of years, but you will start to transact with these. At some point, you may even go to an exchange where you want to withdraw that equivalent in dollars again, or you may want to go to an online shop that accepts Bitcoins and you buy something there. And so if someone puts a decent amount of effort into finding out and tracing down who were the individuals that took part in that transaction, it could be possible. So it's almost like a cost-benefit question whether you can do that. But there is no real anonymity if it's just worth enough to find out who actually participated in the transaction.
Okay, I guess there aren't any more. Oh, all right.
Thank you so much for this presentation. We developed a B2B marketplace in Russia. That is, we made an ICO in the beginning of this year, successful. So we are going to launch our platform next year. And there was some question about the possible business model. You were talking about fees, for example, like a platform of this, yeah? So my question would be, what has to be done that a company, a platform has in its token and having an active marketplace is interesting for potential investors we see, not only because of some fees, but maybe of some token economics?
Yeah, so I would say that
we have a utility token, so
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
this should change. When will it change? What is your view on that?
Union Square Ventures, relatively big and well-known US VC, has recognized the fact that early stage investing today and going forward even more will not just be taking a conventional share equity stake in an early stage company, but in some cases they may need to invest in the tokens, right? Which in the case of a utility token come quite close to an equity stake in the company, because when they own a token, like what I mentioned with Steemit, the social network where you need the Steemit cryptocurrency in order to participate in the network, it's as the usage of Steemit goes up, then theoretically the price of Steemit should also go up. So you have a very equity-like or equity-type exposure to that company. And so some VCs, again, like Union Square Ventures, started to recognize that and started even to invest in that. In the case of USV, I think they invested in a third-party vehicle, so they are not doing these investments directly. This is all public information, so if you are interested in more details, you can look that up. They invested in a vehicle that is investing into tokens, so in order to get exposure to that. And it's probably a bold move. I don't think there are many VCs out there that are doing this. But if this turns out to be successful, if this turns out to be a way for companies, for early stage companies to raise money, and if this turns out to be a way for platforms and for marketplaces specifically to monetize and to incentivize their users to stay on their platform, then ultimately VCs and other early stage and equity investors will for sure follow, right? So, but I think there will need to be a couple of precedents, a couple of success cases, because I believe that investors are typically more conservative and first want to see, a good exit, some success cases before a bigger group of investors starts doing this. But yeah, some started with it, and I think for a couple of platforms, these native currencies, these utility tokens make sense, and I'm sure that we will see cases where this turns out to be hugely successful. Also what Kik is trying, right? One of the platforms that I mentioned in the presentation. It's too early to say today whether this is going to be a financial success, but if it will be, then I'm sure others will follow that model.
I find it quite interesting. You showed us on one slide Upwork, like the classical approach, and ETHLens,
correct,
right?
Yeah.
I checked these two platforms a couple of weeks ago, so you get the impression from Upwork that's really active and it's a big thing. And ETHLens, there's nothing going on there. So people just I have the impression they're simply not using it.
That's one of the things, right? It remains a niche phenomenon as of today, right? And of course, we don't know for sure whether many people will appreciate the fact that ETHLens is permissionless and censorship-free, while Upwork is not, right? I mean, accessibility is obviously not the only feature that's important about a job or freelancer marketplace, right? So there are many other things that need to be in place, that need to work very well for the platform to be successful, right? And yeah, as I said to this other gentleman, I don't think that a lot of these applications will have a huge consumer user base, right? Because simply there isn't such a huge group of users that value censorship-free so highly that they are willing to compromise on some other characteristics and some other features, right? So it may very well be that for some of these applications they remain very niche and will just capture a small percentage of the entire market. However, with the disclaimer that, but that's my personal opinion, that in the B2B space we will see more adoption. But yeah, as I said at the beginning, it's early days for these types of applications.
I hope our platform PC Shop will make it to your presentation next year.
Best of luck.
Are there any more questions? I can't see any, so thank you, Rado, once again.
Yeah, thank you all.